November 1943. The Central Pacific Ocean, 8,000 miles from Tokyo, 4,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. A speck of coral and sand barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide sits inside the Tarawa Atoll, part of the Gilbert Islands. Its name is Betio. On this island, a Japanese naval commander has made a claim that will follow him into history. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, standing before his officers and construction troops, boasts that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. It is not an idle threat. Betio has been transformed into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of ground on Earth, a wall of concrete, coral, and steel bristling with coastal guns, machine gun nests, and interlocking fields of fire, all packed into an area smaller than New York's Central Park. 76 hours later, the island will belong to the United States Marine Corps. Of the more than 4,000 Japanese troops who defended it, only 17 will still be standing. Shibasaki himself will not live to see the outcome of his own prediction. This is the story of how that prediction was made, why it seemed so reasonable to the men who made it, and how it collapsed against an enemy the Imperial Japanese Command had badly underestimated, the United States Marine. By late 1943, the Pacific War had reached a turning point. The United States Navy had blunted the Japanese advance at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, and Marine and Army forces had ground through 6 brutal months of jungle warfare to secure Guadalcanal by February 1943. Momentum in the Pacific had shifted, but the question facing American planners was how to translate that momentum into a path toward Japan itself. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, proposed a new axis of advance, a drive through the Central Pacific, striking directly across open ocean at heavily defended Japanese-held atolls, rather than fighting through the dense jungles of the Southwest Pacific favored by General Douglas MacArthur. This became known as island hopping, seizing key islands to serve as forward air and naval bases while bypassing others. The Gilbert Islands, a chain of coral atolls just south of the equator, were selected as the opening move. Within the Gilberts, one island mattered more than any other, Betio in the Tarawa Atoll, which held the only usable airstrip in the entire island group. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the gateway to the Marshall Islands beyond, and from there, the road toward the Marianas and ultimately Japan. But Betio presented a problem that had never been fully solved in modern warfare: how to land a large assault force directly against a small, heavily fortified island, in daylight, across a shallow coral reef, with no natural harbor and almost no cover. Previous American amphibious landings, including Guadalcanal, had gone in against lightly defended beaches. Tarawa would be different. It would be the first time the Marine Corps assaulted a heavily garrisoned, deliberately fortified position head-on from the sea. Compounding the difficulty, the surrounding reef made conventional landing craft nearly useless. Standard Higgins boats, the workhorse of American amphibious operations, required at least 3 to 4 feet of water to operate, and naval planners did not have reliable, detailed tide charts for the Tarawa Lagoon. This uncertainty would prove catastrophic. On the American side, overall command of the Gilbert's operation, codenamed Operation Galvanic, rested with Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet, and Marine Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, commanding the V Amphibious Corps. Direct command of the landing force at Betio fell to Major General Julian C. Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division. Naval gunfire and the transport of troops ashore was the responsibility of Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill, commanding Task Force 53. When the regimental commander of the 2nd Marines, Colonel William Marshall, fell ill just before the operation, General Smith turned to his executive officer, Colonel David M. Shoup, to take direct command of the assault troops on Betio. Shoup, a career Marine officer, would lead the fight from the beach itself despite being wounded early in the landing, and his conduct during the battle would later earn him the Medal of Honor. On the Japanese side, command of the Tarawa garrison belonged to Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, a 49-year-old officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Shibasaki commanded a mixed force built around the Sasebo 7th Special Naval Landing Force and the 6th Special Naval Landing Force, elite naval infantry units roughly equivalent to Marines, along with a naval construction unit responsible for building the island's defenses. His total garrison numbered close to 4,800 men, including combat troops, laborers, and roughly 1,200 Korean forced laborers who had been brought to the island to help build its fortifications. Supporting the defense was the Imperial Japanese Navy's engineering doctrine of the period, heavily influenced by pre-war coastal defense theory developed for island bases across the Pacific. Betio had been under construction as a fortress for more than a year, giving Shibasaki's engineers ample time to prepare. The road to Tarawa was shaped by prior failures and near failures elsewhere in the Pacific that informed, and in some cases misled, planners on both sides. American amphibious doctrine itself was still maturing. The landings at Guadalcanal in August 1942 had succeeded largely because Japanese defenses there were incomplete and lightly manned at the point of attack. Planners had not yet been tested against a fully prepared, in-depth coastal fortress, and there was no precedent in American military experience for what an assault against Betio's defenses would actually require. On the Japanese side, coastal defense doctrine had itself evolved out of earlier disappointments. Japanese commanders in previous campaigns had sometimes concentrated their defenses too far inland, allowing invaders to establish a beachhead before contact was made. Shibasaki's approach at Betio deliberately reversed this. The doctrine here called for destroying the enemy at the water's edge before troops could ever get a foothold. This beach defense concept, sometimes associated with later Japanese island garrisons as well, was considered at the time the most effective way to stop an amphibious assault outright. American intelligence also failed in a specific and consequential way before the battle. Reconnaissance photography and pre-invasion naval and aerial bombardment led many American commanders to believe that Betio's defenses had been effectively destroyed before the Marines ever set foot on the beach. This proved false. Most of Shibasaki's heavily reinforced concrete bunkers and coconut log ensemble emplacements survived the bombardment largely intact, and his troops, hardened and sheltered underground, emerged ready to fight the moment the barrage lifted. The central technical and tactical innovation of Tarawa was the large-scale combat use of the LVT, the landing vehicle, tracked, commonly called the Amtrac. Unlike the standard Higgins boat, which relied on a flat hull and a retractable ramp and needed sufficient water depth to approach a beach, the LVT was a tracked, armored amphibious vehicle. It could swim through open water using its tracks and cleats for propulsion, then climb directly up onto a reef or beach and continue moving on land, effectively driving straight over obstacles that would strand a conventional landing craft. This mattered enormously at Tarawa because of the reef problem. Naval planners had gambled that a rare dodging tide, an unusually low but still passable tide, would allow loaded Higgins boats to cross the reef surrounding Betio. The gamble failed. On the morning of November 20, 1943, the tide dropped lower than expected, leaving as little as 3 feet of water over the reef in places, far too shallow for standard landing craft. Wave after wave of Higgins boats grounded hundreds of yards from shore, forcing Marines to wade in through open water under direct machine gun and artillery fire. The LVTs, however, were largely able to cross the reef itself and carry the first waves of Marines much closer to the beach, though even they took heavy losses to Japanese coastal guns and anti-tank fire. Colonel Shoup had insisted on committing the available Amtracs to the first assault waves specifically because of the uncertainty over tide conditions, a decision that, while it could not prevent catastrophic casualties, kept the landing from being an outright rout. The mechanism of Japanese resistance itself was equally significant and well documented. Betio's defenses combined 14 large coastal defense guns, several of them originally British guns captured at the fall of Singapore in 1942, with dozens of smaller artillery pieces and more than 100 machine gun positions built into reinforced bunkers of concrete, coral rubble, and coconut logs, connected by trenches and firing across interlocking arcs so that no approach to the beach was left uncovered. This was coastal defense engineering built specifically to annihilate an amphibious assault at the shoreline, exactly as Japanese doctrine intended. The landing began on the morning of November 20, 1943. Following a heavy naval and aerial bombardment that began before dawn, Colonel Shoup led 3 battalions of the 2nd Marine Regiment ashore across 3 landing beaches on Betio's northern, lagoon-facing shore, designated Red Beach 1, 2, and 3. The reef gamble failed almost immediately. Later landing waves relying on Higgins boats found themselves stranded far offshore, and Marines were forced to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under direct fire from Japanese positions that had survived the bombardment intact. Casualties in the first hours were severe. By the end of the first day, of roughly 5,000 Marines who had landed, nearly 1,500 had become casualties, and Shoup's now famous situation report back to Divisional Command captured the desperation of the moment in 2 words: issue in doubt. Fighting continued through the second day, November 21, as reinforcements and Sherman medium tanks were brought ashore to help crack Japanese strongpoints one at a time. Naval gunfire support and coordinated infantry assaults gradually pushed inland, though progress was measured in yards rather than miles. By the third day, November 22, Marines had begun to break the back of organized Japanese resistance, isolating and reducing bunkers individually with grenades, flamethrowers, and demolition charges. A grim, close-range method of fighting that would become the model for the assaults on other fortified Pacific islands in the years ahead. Early on the fourth day, November 23, most organized Japanese resistance collapsed following a final, desperate mass counterattack, a banzai charge that cost the remaining defenders the last of their fighting strength. Admiral Shibasaki was killed during the fighting, reportedly while attempting to relocate his command post after his original bunker had been overrun and converted by the Marines into an aid station. Of the Japanese garrison, only 17 soldiers and a number of Korean laborers survived to be taken prisoner. The lessons of Tarawa were absorbed rapidly and applied across the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The battle proved at enormous cost that amphibious operations against fortified coral islands required far more Amtraks, far more sustained and accurate naval gunfire preparation, and far more detailed hydrographic and tidal intelligence than had previously been considered necessary. In the months that followed, the U.S. military dramatically increased production and allocation of LVTs for subsequent operations, including the landings on Kwajalein and Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands in early 1944, and later at Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. Naval bombardment doctrine was revised to extend and intensify pre-landing fires, and closer coordination between naval gunfire, carrier aircraft, and landing forces became standard practice for the remainder of the war. The Navy and Marine Corps also expanded their underwater demolition capabilities in direct response to Tarawa's reef disaster, laying the groundwork for what would become the Navy's underwater demolition teams, the forerunners of the modern Navy SEALs, whose job was to reconnoiter and clear obstacles ahead of future amphibious landings, so that the tidal miscalculation that had cost so many lives at Betio would not be repeated. The human cost of Tarawa shocked the American public. In just 76 hours of fighting on an island smaller than most American city parks, the 2nd Marine Division suffered more than 1,000 dead and over 2,000 wounded, casualty figures approaching those of the 6-month Guadalcanal campaign, compressed into 3 days. Newsreel footage and photographs of Marine dead on the beaches of Betio, released to the American public shortly after the battle, produced a wave of public grief and controversy over whether such losses had been necessary or avoidable. That controversy had a direct effect on subsequent American planning. Military and political leaders, aware of the public reaction, pushed harder for improvements in amphibious doctrine, tidal and reef intelligence, and pre-landing bombardment, changes that measurably reduced, though never eliminated, the human cost of later island assaults. For the Japanese military and government, Tarawa demonstrated something equally significant, though drawn from opposite conclusions. Despite an overwhelming American advantage in firepower, naval support, and numbers, a small, well-prepared, deeply entrenched garrison had been able to inflict severe casualties and hold out for days against a vastly larger force. This reinforced, rather than discouraged, the Japanese strategy of static, in-depth island defense that would be employed with even greater ferocity at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa later in the war, battles that, in turn, proved even costlier for American forces than Tarawa had been. In the decades since 1943, Tarawa has remained a central case study in the history and doctrine of amphibious warfare. Military academies and staff colleges continue to study the battle as an example of both the risks of amphibious assault against fortified positions and the operational innovations, particularly the tracked amphibious vehicle, that made such assaults survivable and ultimately successful. The Amtrak itself evolved directly out of the lessons of Tarawa into the modern assault amphibious vehicle, and later the amphibious combat vehicle used by the United States Marine Corps today, vehicles that trace their lineage in doctrine and design directly back to the LVTs that struggled across Betio's reef in November 1943. The remains of Betio's wartime fortifications, rusted coastal guns, pillbox ruins, and wrecked landing craft remain visible on the island today, now part of the independent nation of Kiribati, and the site continues to draw military historians and the occasional recovery mission searching for the remains of Marines still listed as missing from the battle. Shibasaki's boast, meanwhile, has taken on a life beyond the battle itself. Quoted and requoted in histories, documentaries, and Marine Corps lore for more than 80 years, It has become one of the most enduring examples in American military memory of an enemy commander's confidence being answered, in the span of just over 3 days, by results no one on either side fully anticipated. The problem that faced American planners in late 1943 was straightforward to state and brutally difficult to solve. How do you take a small, heavily fortified island, defended by a determined garrison, when the sea itself works against you? Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki believed he had solved that problem from the defender's side, and by every reasonable measure of the fortifications he commanded, his confidence was not unfounded. Betio was, by the standards of 1943, one of the most heavily defended patches of ground on the planet. What Shibasaki could not fully account for was the willingness of the men opposing him to keep coming, wading through chest-deep water under machine gun fire, crawling across sand to place a satchel charge against a bunker wall, climbing out of a stalled landing craft into open fire rather than turning back. The technology that broke the deadlock, the amphibious tractor, mattered, but it was the combination of that technology with sustained, costly, close-range human effort that ultimately decided the battle. Tarawa's legacy is not simply the defeat of one commander's prediction. It is the record of how quickly military doctrine can be forced to change under the pressure of hard-won, painfully learned experience, lessons paid for in November 1943, and applied at lower cost in human life. On every fortified beach, the United States Marine Corps would assault for the remainder of the Second World War.